Hey friends, welcome back. I decided I needed a change of scenery today. The weather was just entirely too nice to continue to be in the office, so in place of a whiteboard, you have painted T 11 siding. I know that may be slightly less useful, and you may get some background noise of cars in the neighborhood and occasional plane flying over, or the pages of my Bible flipping while the wind blows, but we're going to give this a shot. And for those of you who don't mind the sounds of a truck pulling lawn equipment by every once in a while, then this should be a little bit different, a little bit maybe more interesting for those of you who enjoy background noise way of doing this. And very likely I'll be back inside next week, but today was not the day to be inside. It's just too nice. We are continuing on our study of the Gospel of Matthew this evening. I am excited to be moving closer and closer to the end of Matthew, which maybe sounds terrible to say, but I can live with myself for saying that. As much as I've enjoyed our detailed look at Matthew's Gospel, in 10 weeks, maybe, when I get to talk about something different, I'm not going to be offended. That said, I'm already looking towards what we're doing next, so if you have some ideas, by all means, float in my direction. I always have some of my own, but I appreciate input. So for those of you who watch these, start talking to me. If you've not done so already, 45 weeks in, please take the time to sit down and read through Matthew's Gospel. I think it really does make a difference to take it all in one setting. Two, if you have to, but really, if you can do it in one, that's ideal. Tonight's passage continues a conversation that Jesus has been having there in the temple area with temple leaders now for us a few weeks. And it is the third of three parables. Those parables slowly build on each other until we get to this point. So like we have the last several weeks, I'm going to give you the passage that we're looking at tonight, which is Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. What I would encourage you to do is read not just verses 1 through 14 of 22, but go all the way back, probably to the cursing of the fig tree in 21:18, and read forward from that point, so that you can see those verses and how they slowly build on each other to bring us to this moment. The parable of the two sons, the parable of the evil farmer, now the parable of the great feast, all play into each other. And so read it all if you can. If those are still pretty fresh on your memory, then read just verses 1 through 14 of chapter 22, and we will continue on in just a moment. Hit pause, do your reading, and then come back. And we're back. Glad that you've joined us. We are... at a very interesting verse. And one thing that's probably helpful as we read through these verses is have some understanding of like first century marriage practices in the Jewish community. So those practices look very different than what we have now. Instead of, a short ceremony and a reception afterwards, instead, the ceremony itself in the first century was pretty much non-existent. It was kind of it was a walk, actually. The bridal family would walk the daughter to her future husband's house. The marriage would be pronounced and consummated, and then they would have this massive feast. And the feast, if you were not very well off, not very well connected, would be short. If you were well off and well connected, it would be longer. It was kind of a potluck, it maybe is the right way to say that, where people would bring and donate food, because how that feast went said something about your value to the community, your standing in the community. And so those would be prepared well in advance. And so in this parable that you've read, it starts by not fully explaining how we get to this point, because it wouldn't have needed to be explained to them. The first people who get invited have received an invitation and have RSVP'd. And so on the day that it's actually going to begin, those who RSVP'd receive a reminder. Today is the day, come on. And so what you see in these verses is something that you would not have seen. This does not happen, where people who have said they are going to be there to a feast, a banquet, then suddenly decide not to show up. But these verses are being used allegorically here by Matthew again, something that he is more prone to do to others. If you read this parable in Luke and Mark's gospel, those details, those big explanations are not there. Instead, it's much more straightforward, much simpler. Matthew gives us a more broad and more specific, more allegorical explanation of these verses, and that's very intentional, because the image that Matthew is building for his readers and has been over these preceding parables and over these verses is one of God's choosing and our rejecting. And so here we get this final image of rejection, where those who were first invited and who first responded now have chosen not to be chosen. Maybe that's the right way to say that. It is intentionally provocative of Jesus to deliver this message to the crowd that he does, to the Pharisees and temple leaders who have now been there for these three, but he's been provoking them with each story that he tells. And then we get, again, these images of abuse and of murder of the messengers, which take us back all the way to Moses and to the early judges and to the early prophets. And then we see, again, another round of that type of, as they abuse the prophets before me type things. This is things that Jesus has been saying all along the way. And then we get a very, very interesting note that the king's response is then to burn down the town of those who rejected him, which is the king's town. Like that if he is the king and it's the town of his subjects, then he's torching his own property. And again, this doesn't need to be read hyper literal, but it definitely needs to be understood in form of imagery. And I think what Matthew is doing here takes what Jesus said and again kind of offers explanation and layers that Mark and Luke don't, pointing specifically to the destruction of the temple. And then he invites more people, a different group of people. And for Matthew's audience, for Matthew's gospel, I think it's pretty simple to say that what we're talking about now here is Gentiles. We've got this move from the chosen people of Israel to the Gentile community. Now, whether that's exactly what Jesus meant when he first told the parable, I've talked before. What our gospel writers do is provide theological depth to their communities from what Jesus said decades before. And whether or not the Pharisees would have completely understood what Jesus is saying, Matthew's audience here would have understood it in a very particular way. With the burning and destruction of the city and now a new group of invitees. Also, this is not only talked about in the Christian community during Matthew's day, one of which was not deeply separated from the Jewish community all the way through the first century and even into the early second. You still have followers of Jesus who are continuing to go to the synagogues for worship. They are Jews, and they see Jesus as this fulfillment. There are Christian synagogues of sorts, places where Jesus is understood to be a part of this ongoing work of God. And there are plenty more that are not, but that split, that hard separation's not there. And of course you see in Paul's writings, the attempt to merge these two communities becomes very difficult. But that's, I think, a different conversation for a different day. Instead here, I think we need to look specifically at the choosing and responding, because that's what Jesus is talking about with the Pharisees who are in front of him, and that's certainly how Matthew relays it to his community. God has chosen, people have responded. God doesn't force, it's not, God doesn't make people do anything a certain way. And then we get this final note that just because you receive an invitation doesn't mean that there's not still some responsibility on your end to do more than just show up. Because the final note that we get in these verses involves a guest who showed up but didn't bother putting on the proper attire for the wedding. With Matthew's emphasis on discipleship, again, I don't think we have to look very hard to understand that that's what Matthew is talking about here. We are chosen. We are all invited. By the time this is over, God has invited a whole slew of people. Everybody has been invited. Those who responded first, those who weren't invited first, but are invited second, becomes this whole group. And yet, there is a responsibility beyond God's invitation on our end. And discipleship is very much that responsibility. And so you have this final reminder, for many are called, but few are chosen, which I think has been misread in a lot of ways throughout history. And we can get into the whole choosing, election, predestination conversation that people dive into. And I think the way that this parable comes across, we do the choosing. God has invited, but we choose. We elect how we respond to God's invitation, whether that's to ignore it, whether that's to respond positively in discipleship, or whether that's to do nothing but think we're going to get to mooch off the feast. And for Matthew's first audience, there is a very clear understanding here that invitation requires a response. We all respond one way or another. And Matthew wants us to pay attention to how. All right. Well, I love that right now, as I'm finishing up, is finally the moment when things have gotten relatively quiet in the neighborhood. That makes perfect sense. I've asked for your input on what we do next. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and call it an evening. If you have not taken the time to read through the Gospel of Matthew, do so. These videos are kept forever and ever on Facebook and on YouTube. So if you've missed a few and want to catch up, they're always available for you to look up as well. All right, glad you took the time to join us. I will see you next week.